All right. So good afternoon, everybody. Well, it's a pleasure to have all you here today. And today it's so we take the opportunity to kick off the meeting from our side, so from the Delft side or from the European side of this very fruitful and engaging and promising collaboration that we started earlier in this semester. And this is because we have, the lecture today will be given by one of the persons that was instrumental to put this collaboration together, let's say, and to make it work, Leandro Medrano. And so Leandro will give a lecture that is dedicated to the theme or an overview of social housing in São Paulo over the last 2 decades. And this is part of our lecture series that we have been entertaining, let's say, since the beginning of this collaboration already, well, I think 6 weeks ago or something like that, and part of the course São Paulo into the Void that has 2 different branches. Well, one in Delft that will develop further a project for housing approach to Barra Funda, dealing with the topic of the voids, let's say, and in the case of the FAUUSP students dealing with with the same theme, but as part of a more, let's say, theoretical and historical approach. So the team from the FAUUSP is, let's say, is composed of Leandro, who will give the lecture today, but also Luis Recaman, Marcos Rosa, and Mariana Wilderom. So all of them here, and for most of you, familiar faces already. And from the Delft side, Vanessa Grossman, who is also, let's say, almost a Palestana. So it's a Palestana infiltrated now in Delft. And then Harold Moy, a real Delftian, but with origins in the north of the Netherlands, in Frisia. Oh, I should say, is it Frisia or it's correct, right?
Groningen.
Groningen. So not to mistake with Frisia, because that's the neighboring region. So. And myself, Nelson Mota, originally from Portugal. Well, I guess that we know already each other quite well, at least most of us. And so this series of lectures is also an opportunity to debate the relationship between a particular characteristic of Barra Funda, which has to do with its low housing density, but also the way that it's related with the housing crisis in São Paulo, and the agenda of urban social movements that claim the right to the city. And these, the characteristics of Barra Funda for all of us have been offered as a fantastic platform to discuss, some of these issues, in particular in the context of São Paulo and addressing the issue of the urban void. So as you see, we will be recording the class, but this is for educational purposes only. And at the end of the lecture, we will open for questions. Now, we are very honored to have Leandro Medrano, who is a professor at the Department of History and Architecture and Design Aesthetics at Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism of the University of São Paulo. Leandro graduated and pursued his PhD in São Paulo, and he holds a master's degree from the Universitat Politecnica de Catalunya in Barcelona, and carried out postdoctoral research at Universitad Politecnica de Madrid, so the Polytechnic University of Madrid. In 2018, Leandro was a visiting researcher at TU Delft, so this was also a great opportunity to have Leandro close by, working with us, also participating in our educational program. And this was also part of a research project, a FAPESP thematic project, with the name Architecture and Urbanism Addressing the Social Space in the 21st Century, that Leandro and Luis are coordinating and involves teams from, many parts of the world, including the TU Delft, but also ETH Zurich, KTH Stockholm, Yale, Harvard, Madrid. So, and this is also something that has brought us together, and to a certain extent, what paved the way for this collaboration. Leandro is also editor-in-chief of the FAUUSP journal Revista Pós, and the coordinator of the PC3 research group. Leandro authored the books Housing and the Contemporary City, São Paulo and Madrid, and also Vilanova Artigas, Housing and the City in Brazilian Modernization, and also the book The Virtualities of Living, Artigas and the Metropolis. And recently co-edited together with Luis and Tom Avermaet, the book The New Urban Condition, Criticism and Theory from Architecture and Urbanism, which gathers many of the participants in the research projects that I mentioned before, where we are also included. So it's a great pleasure for me to invite Leandro to share with us the screen, to share his screen with us, and to give us this lecture on the recent developments in social housing in São Paulo. Thank you, Leandro. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Nelson. I can try to share the screen. Is it good for you?
Yes, it's great.
Yeah?
Full screen.
That's great.
Perfect.
Well, let's go. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Well, I will talk about social housing in São Paulo, especially about the recent production. Let me try to change. I know that you are studying this topic with a lot of intensity, but even so, I chose to give a panoramic presentation on the topic. So I will not comment on each project in detail, but rather expose the projects after a brief theoretical and historical introduction. Perhaps this historical introduction is a little bit redundant at this stage of the course, but I thought that it's important to do it anyway. Without it, which I promise to be very brief, the presentation of the project would be meaningless. Brazil has a deficit of 7.7 million homes. Since the late 16th, many architects and urban planners have been working in social housing team. The means of action are diverse, ranging from theoretical production to political activism. One of the great achievements of this process was the insertion of the right to the decent house as an item of the 1988 Constitution, still enforced today. What I intend to show you is a working process. It's part of a research project developed since 2006, and the result will be published in a book that is in the process of being edited. As some of you may know, Brazil, especially São Paulo, has a strong disciplinary tradition linked to the modern movement. In a recent article, Professor Luis Camanda emphasized that the results of the modern technical industrial society are well exemplified in Brazil, where the modern impulse has split in two poles, integral formalism and systematic functionality. The first, a vocabulary synthesis of the modern Brazilian architecture in a meteoric rise from the 13th. In the second, emulation of the German social democratic molecule, state architecture and industry, promoting social house and territorial planning. The first case was fruitful, arrived in Brasilia, where it ended its ideological cycle. The second, the modern social house experience, was excitant and did not achieve great technological success or even a special transformation of the cities. However, it becomes the greatest contemporary legacy, at least in the disciplinary intellectual field. In this context, we see the existence of a disciplinary singularity that emerged with the same social structure of our hyper-late modernization, namely the project of segregate urban spaces for a segregate society. This point of view, quite critical, is not so familiar in Brazilian research. And it's on this point that I follow my presentation today, which is based on the methodological tradition of critical theory, or as Neil Brenner defines, the urban critical theory. In this sense, the critical analysis of the modern Brazilian housing experience in the 20th century has shown, as in other parts of the world, the obstacles between the rationalization of the production and the rationalization of the space, especially in São Paulo, the epicenter of the country industrial modernization. This presentation is intended to discuss the limits of this kind of city-lung and the radical architecture of the first age machine without adjustments in the context of Brazilian industrial modernization, and especially shed light on the new strategies that began to emerge in conjunction with urban policies created in the first decade of the century. After the 1913 revolution, commanded by Getúlio Vargas, many authors consider that Brazil would have had its first large-scale production experience of social house, as well as its first experience of housing architecture. Housing architecture linked to the modern movement and the CIM process or Congress, a kind of a national welfare state. This experience was carried out by IAPs. IAPs is an acronym for Retirement and Pension Institute, an income fund dedicated to the working class. The IAPs building the most emblematic housing project in the first half of the 20th century. I do not question the uniqueness and relevance of these architectures, but the results of the research problematize this dominant view of the analytical literature of this field, mainly because it reveals that the political structure of the IAPs was very different from the practiced by the European welfare states. Thus, the research sought to introduce new critical parameters that emphasize the relationship between the social program and their urban externalities, something that could only be done in the light of certain theoretical instruments that evolved from the 17th and which gain evidence given the circumstance of this first decade of the 21st century. That is, given the ideological crisis of the new liberalism. In this sense, the work of the social sciences, Marta Fara, published in the 18th, is quite enlightening. According to the author, the IAP's model cannot be considered a urban policy strategy for production of social house, insofar as the response of the ideological and economic interests of the peripheral capitalism formation. The ideological interest of the state house production via IAPs results of the need to incorporate in the centralized state perspective the basic needs of the working class. The interest of the state was to control the working class, not emancipate in the direction of full urban life. Therefore, the central role of the state housing production was the task of neutralize political conflicts. With regard to economic interests, what can be characterized by this housing production is the fact that it was a secondary scheme. After all, the meaning of these investments in housing would be the valorization of the applied capital, which conflicts with the necessities of housing policies that usually involve subsidized investments. Therefore, according to Marta Fara research, the experience of IAPs results from objective difference from those related to the modern life in space and the construction of new urban space. Besides that, this restricted house production should not be pursued in a large housing provision policy for working class. After all, only 124,000 units were produced, which is not much for Brazil, and most for the middle class, not for the really poor class. The distance of this building from the original matrix giving to the Brazilian architecture an authority for originality, of course, but it also alienates them from the universalized ideas of social modernity. It's a kind of fake modernity. But before commenting on the works, I remember for the literary passage of the Franciscan friar Vicente do Salvador, writing in the 16th century. Truly, that is, this land thinks are chance, because all of it is not a republic, every house being. When we saw this phrase in a text in privacy condition colony of the historian Fernando Novaes, what we had already observed in the empirical studies acquired a historical dimension. In Brazil, since its colonial formation, the house is the republic, not the city. This is a fundamental to understand the Brazilian architecture. This is fundamental to understand the Brazilian architecture, sorry. Many the issues of condominiums, which currently impact you, the most of you, I must say that I prefer the term urban enclosure or gate secured zones, as Stuart Hodgson usually used in the article, The New Urban Enclosures, for example. Well, this idea of the house not needed the city can be understood as a local characteristic, but would you go further? Many authors have argued that it is a strategy of neoliberalism in terms of urbanism. After all, isolation in small domestic strongholds encourages competitions and the individual desires. At the same time, it submits bodies and minds to neoliberal ideologies schemes. I'd like to emphasize that this is not just a security issues. It's a typological and spatial issues. Take a look in these famous examples that you certainly know, the Mirador building, a project by Invier de and de Blancalel, built in San Chinarro, neighborhood in Madrid, a neighborhood of Madrid. Even in a safe place, the residents decide to enclose to the lot, to the limits of the building. Certainly not to define the distinction between public and private space, including with this kind of a funny solution. It's very weird for us. Well, the first project that I will present to you is the Várzea do Carmo, building the city of São Paulo through the IEPs. This housing complex was designed in the 1938 by the architect Atílio Corrêa Lima and partners. The housing of Várzea do Carmo is considered one of the first large modern housing projects carried out in Brazil. Its architects sought to take advantage of the large scale housing production to restructure cities following the CIM precepts. Before this project, the technicians believed that the isolated houses reinforced the family nucleus because they would ensure the isolation of the domestic nucleus from the city's social contexts, considered promiscuous at the time. The research for density, diversity, and sociability as a consensus in contemporary urban planning was, in the 30s, a social evil to be avoided. The role of Várzea do Carmo, contrary to that was used in the period, proposed the densification and the verticalization in an area near the city center of São Paulo. It stands out in the original solution presented by the architects, the double scale of the vertical blocks, which makes the proposal even more radical than the German city looms of the 30s. The tabula rasa, a fundamental principle of modern operation, was possible in the suburban areas of a German city. But in the urbanized areas, the typological construction in the city looms looking for arrangement and scales that in some way refer to the traditional urbanism, like this kind of perimeter blocks and the delimited streets and things like that. Unlike the appeasement found in some Sinnelung in Frankfurt or Berlin, the Vaso do Carmo complex radicalized its options for a modern typology, which is closer to Hildesheimer's radical experience in his Kronstadt. But what you can see as a modern radicalism also conceals a right degree of ideological neutrality. Now, we know that the fundamental resource of the universalizing strategy, that is the spatial abstraction of the urban structure, will intensify the spatial conflicts in the traditional city. But the contradiction between design and social reality must be highlighted as an explanation of the urban phenomenon that develops in the following years. The spatial reality of the city assumes its segregated forms and intensify its social conflicts, the opposite of modernization. What would be the synthesis of the emancipated and the modern city becomes an official version of a segregated space. We can see this scheme in several IEPs constructing through Brazil. And also in several housing projects built during the military dictatorship. In this case, read without the vernier or the glamour of architecture. In relation to these large housing projects, I would like to comment on how some of them have been appropriated to the everyday life. A recent research carried out by the researcher Raymond Hell from ETH Zurich tried to design the enlargements made in the famous Cidade de Deus complex that is shown here. As in so many others, the expansion and the annex result from the daily needs, transforming the practical rationality of these large groups into urban conformation closer to the vernacular or historical cities. In other words, the commerce and the public life delimitate the street and the sense of the city. You can see it in this draws, the Cidade de Deus complex, that the first one is like a modern complex, and after in some decades, they construct this kind of new buildings around the building. And in some sense, it's similar to the peripheral occupation that you can see in some historical and European cities. Health research was not exactly spatially or morphologically interested, but I emphasize that this information can be very useful for critical urban analysis in the case of this course, for example. So another example of the Cidade de Deus, the units, and the units with some new buildings. Well, in 1967, Vilanova Artigas designed one of the most emblematic works, his most emblematic works, the Secap of Guarulhos, whose authorship was shared with the architects Paulo Mendes da Rocha and Fábio Penteado. Secap became a paradigmatic case for discipline, because unlike the real estate market output, Secap was a disciplinary proposal. Sorry. To come back. In this sense, Secap seems an aging innovation compared to the international environment. In those years, new vanguards, counterculture, and technological experimentation gained preeminence, which result in architectural and cultural phenomena such as Ant Farm, Mata Clark, Super Studio, Archigram, the Metabolists in Japan, and Sérgio Ferro and the group the New Architecture in Brazil, among others. Not to mention those who bet in those years on the contextual urbanism based on historical tradition, local values, and the bottom-up political and design process. In those times, the tension and contradiction between the ideological foundation of modernity and its architectural version were questioned by authors such as Meis Capiro and Manfredo Tafuri. Moreover, they were accentuated by the formation of the so-called Math Society, which introduced new themes of modern cultural ideas, such as the consumer industry, the television, and the advertising. The so-called post-utopian, in turn, signaled that both criticism and disciplinary practice should be adapted to this new condition. The postmodern condition used the terms from David Harvard, for example. But then, what would be the great novelty by the SECAP? For local criticism, SECAP was considered a promising experience by bringing large-scale housing production close to the industrial techniques of serial construction. I go along south by architects engaged in the novelties of the disciplines. The scheme should guarantee the replicability of the model in the large scale, and thus define a new moment of Brazilian housing policy. Your large precast beams that the rationale of the rationality of the circulation, the moderation of the compositions plans, and the detailed design of the household equipment confirmed that the project sought to certain later adaptation of the modernity. A modernity via the so-called policy school, committed to the industrialization process that characterized the city and its metropolitan area. The novelty would be the radicalism with which Artigas and his team would confront the city in explosion. One could not accept appeasement in this relationship that arises from the conflict. And the verticalization of the form and the proposal must be understood in its local reality or in its radically intense. Now, a little parenthesis. One of the work of the researcher group, PC3s, has been the development of the collective housing booklets, the CHC. These booklets systematize dozens of the data and grammatical information about collective housing built in São Paulo and in Brazil. This work resulted from a partnership with the Givico group from its UPM in Madrid. And the Givico developed this methodology, and we proposed to do the same, so we could compare projects with the same research method. Well, this is some imaging of this booklet that, of course, we have some projects that I showed you. And the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism of Porto, Portugal, joined us in this partnership and has already published some volumes. Sorry. In addition to the print version, this material is available for download from the website that is indicated in this image. And you can download it if you want. Well, let's go back to São Paulo. In recent decades, São Paulo has undergone significant changes, most of them resulting from progressive governments committed to the urban issues. I suppose that Fernandes Melo Franco lectures present part of these transformations. An example is the 2014 Master Plan, which implements new guidelines for urban mobility system and the morphological configuration of some areas. In addition, it encourages buildings that present diversity of a function and the diversity of social groups, social mix, social fruits, and so on. Functional mix and so on. It's also innovative in relation to the participation of the citizens in the main themes through face-to-face public consultations and by digital media. These are some images from the Master Plan booklet, made with an infograph to be understood by the lay people. To the end of this presentation, I will present some proposals of social housing built in or designed in the first decade of the century. when we link the kind of new welfare state. In the first part of the research, these projects were visited, redesigned, and photographed. Mariana Wilderman helped me with this process in the beginning. The key information was gathered in a single graphic that you can see here together, and the projects were divided into 4 axes of interpretation: block, informal innovation, commons, and reuse. Well, since the 14th, São Paulo has chosen to adopt the model, the lot model, the private plot of the land. It is the lot that determines the construction regulation. They indicate setbacks in the morphology according to the characteristics of the lot itself. Recently, the block discussion has gained preeminence, mainly for its possibility of connection with the street, for example. This connection would avoid the walls which spread throughout the city from the heights. The block, common in Europe, and also common in some neighborhoods in Brazilian cities, such as Rio de Janeiro, tends to be a challenge to city urban design patterns. Some example about the blocks in São Paulo and in the world. Oops. Wow. Now I show to you the Bizelli Cachiburian project and the Seabi Heliopsis from 2014. Well, the idea of this project was to create an urban block capable of creating living space clearly defined by architecture, and at the same time, new urban relations to the local context. After all, this type of typological configuration is very unusual in São Paulo. Some images of this project, I just will show for you. Another project, the residential Alexandre Mackenzie. In this case, the block model is a little out of the classic perimeter alignment. The buildings of Cyprian construction and form seek to articulate space that define the transition between tension of the surrounds and the possibility of socialization in the interior of the block, in the court. As you can see, the architects try to organize this kind of simple buildings and transform the space between the buildings in something useful or something like the interior of the peripheral blocks, like you can see in another example of urban design around the world. Well, there is another one that beside the previous one, this build is not yet building, but he seeks to go to the same strategy, but with more audacious forms results that in this perimetrical occupation. Of course, we try to organize himself according to the plot, and then the result is a kind of not so simple form of building. Well, São Paulo seems to have no form. Some things that usually please Dutch architects. It seems to be a fun city for creative architects. When Henk Koolhaas was at the height of his fame in the 90s, for example, until today, he used to say that he wanted to be a Brazilian architect. I don't know if you know that. As to say, an architect who can do whatever he wants. And this kind of phrase is very famous from Cuba, like "fuck the contest," is very useful for the Brazilian architects to do whatever they want. They want. Well, the debate is interesting, and I appreciate the innovation that you can see in the architecture, of course, especially in the housing sector. I will show here works that see this kind of dialogue with innovation that you can see in the Dutch architecture in the housing sector in the 90s, for example. But in this case, with the informal city. The first one is this project you already know. But this project is a pioneering project by Villeca and Associate. It was his first attempt to create what he calls third territory, something between the formal and the informal, a sociable territory that would articulate conflicts in with urban elements. Yeah, it's not exactly the Santo Amaro project, but it's Eliop's part A that maybe you don't know. And Villeca tried to do this kind of connection between this land, the area, or this kind of typical, not exactly land, but informal construction. And they try to build a new building or a new architecture that connects both with this kind of public or counter-public spaces between both. Some draws, beautiful one in Villeca. Well, this one you know. One of the urban policies adopted these years sought to action in the so-called risky areas. That is, prioritize solutions for the most vulnerable land areas. Almost ours, these areas are next to water streams, used as an opus source. In this sense, this process includes housing for who live in these areas and channeling these streams. Like the Parque Nova Mar, that try to use this kind of process for reorganize the area that was very well problematic because the water of the streams and topography and so on. And in that sense, the architecture or the urbanization tried to not to solve exactly the local problem, but some problems that are in all the neighborhoods. Another project that I like that was not constructed, but I selected especially for the Global Housing Study. Each one of the Villeca's first land projects. It was not built, but it was a very interesting concept. In short, the architect realized that the most problematic areas of the favela are those that are far from the streets, the inner of the block, for example. So they made the proposal to create large buildings such as staples, connecting and urbanize these problematic areas. Residents of the removed house would live in these new buildings. You can see in these draws, they identify these problematic areas, remove the house, and construction of new buildings in this place. It's not a total transformation for the informal areas lands, but it's a kind of alternative to deal with that urban configuration, and restructure the area by the urban plan and by the architecture. The next one is the Jardim Edith from MMBB architects. When you see these projects out of the context, It seems one of the good examples of the traditional Paulista school. However, the intriguing thing here is the search for certain contextualism. Not in the same way that you have seen in the Aldo Rossi or Vittorio Gregotti, who search in the historical city for their typological and the formal source. In this case, the intention is to make the social housing part of the landscape of a middle-class neighborhood. Thus, the building itself follow the same heatings and the local verticalization. And it's a kind of camouflage the self in the neighborhood. It's difficult to see where is the social house or where is the housing for middle class or high middle class in the same neighborhoods. The social house are these two blocks. I don't know if you can see them. Yes. Next one, commons. Commons have become recurring themes in today's architecture. At least since Eleanor Armstrong in the 1990s coined the terms urban commons, and David Harvey emphasized the term in his book Rebuild Cities from 2010. This gap in the new liberal project has been explored as a counterpoint to the hyper-privatization of cities and the growth of the so-called enclosures. The special logical and the special segregation of the special segregation, as geographer Milton Sands taught us, determines symmetrical and systematic social segregation. In short, enclosed urbanization does not result in city, and so it does not result in architecture and urbanism, at least when we think in the social and the aesthetic meanings. Commons have also become an environmental theme, as the compass is essential to the nature resource conservation strategies. This only seems possible when we not transform natural resources into exchanging value in commodities, for example. Sorry. Well, the first project that I will present to you is from Andrade Moretin, architects. It's called Jardim Ligiane. And this project stands out for this implementation, which I consider intelligent given the complex of the site. But what really should be highlighting this highlight is the intention to build links with the small local Islam or with the small local community. The main strategy for this boundary is the creation of a commercial street, take advantage of an existing local feature. It's the project that is in a place, well, quite near from Barra Funda. And they try to organize the building and the complex and create this new street and try to do a kind of connection and creating a common place between both the new building for social housing and the old buildings that the community lives around the building. Another project is from Base Urbana Architects called the Favela do Sapé or Sapé Slums. The case of the Sapé Slum is similar to the previous one. The new buildings, with clear links to the tradition of São Paulo school, seek to connection with the local reality. In this case, the pivot point is the water streams that cuts through this slum. The project proposed the cleaning of the stream and its urbanization as a central element of the urbanization process. It's the stream, it's the slum with some original buildings, and it's the new buildings that they construct in the area. It's the strain after the urbanization process. Well, reuse, maintenance, conservation, restoration, rehabilitation, renovation, reuse, they have become a common vocabulary in the field of architecture and urbanism. Not without reason, the impact of construction environment is unquestionable. It seems a consensus that the task of reusing everything that has been built must be a premise of the new generation of architects. Even so, a recent study found that Brazil has the equivalent of 4.8 million homes in abandoned properties. That is, in theory, Brazil could end up with this land practically without building new housing. It's weird. Of course, there is a legal barrier to this, but in recent decades, some urban policy instruments have helped to turn these properties into social housing. The main milestone is the question of social value of property, which is part of the 1988 Constitution. The social value of property legitimizes legal action concerning real estate that does not fulfill its social functions. Thus, the reason for this vacancy related to the real estate speculation, tax debts, and family spoils can be challenged in court. Only in the city of São Paulo, it is estimated that there are 148,000 of building area, vertical, that today is empty, without any use. A total of 94 buildings. In 2014, when São Paulo had a progressive administration, it was intense to reuse 41 of these buildings. I will show you one of the most emblematic cases of renovation in our retrofit, the Riachuelo building in the central area of São Paulo. The Riachuelo building is in downtown São Paulo. This building, originating from office rooms, has been abandoned for decades. Some years ago, the city administration has decided to turn it into social housing. The project is considered a success case, as the transformation was not expensive, and the result has worked very well. Some images of this building, Riachuelo 1, before the renovation and the reuse and after that. Well, that's it. I hope that it was useful for you to understand what's going on here in the field of social housing. Some recent advances deserve attention, but there is still a lot to do, mainly about the construction of social housing in large scale. Brazil is a large country with totally different climates and culture depending on the region. I hope that one day the country can be a great laboratory, international laboratory for housing issue. We need it a lot. I suppose you have the condition included for that, but you have to build an adequate social, economical, and political condition. Well, to finish this presentation, I'd like to highlight this reflection by the scholar Kanisha Gudivardena. It's a reflection on Lefebvre's contribution to the contemporary urban studies. The phrase is, there can be no revolution without urban revolution, no urban revolution without revolution, and neither without a revolution of everyday life. And this kind of conflict between, well, what we need to building or to project and the everyday life, the existing city, is very important for us understanding our condition nowadays and understanding the disciplines in the 21st century. Of course, we are talking not exactly about the revolution as in the past, like socialists or communists and so on, but toward a kind of global society capable to overcome its current crisis, the moral crisis, environmental crisis, and economic crisis too, and thus survive at least more than a few decades. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leandro. It was great. Yes, thank you so much. I think this was a fantastic overview of how the issue of social housing addressed as a societal issue, but also how it has been addressed by architects in Brazil and in general, but particularly in São Paulo, is, I have to say, quite inspiring, because it also touches upon many issues that we have been dealing with, particularly in this studio, but actually also in our research, but also educational programs, let's say, exploring the housing issues elsewhere. So as we wrote in the chat, let's say we are, you are more than welcome. I mean, all the participants are more than welcome to submit, submit a question, let's say, in the chat or live now. So I think we have some time for that, right? Let's go for it. So there's a long, so Carolina, I think, right? She wrote, would you like to, well, since we have only one there in the chat, I guess that maybe some of us also have questions that could put to Leandro, but maybe Carolina, you could ask the question directly. Is that okay?
Hi, yes, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you a lot for the lecture, for sure. It was really interesting to see all the projects. I was wondering about one thing, because I was watching some videos about social housing in São Paulo, and especially the one about Parque Santa Amaro. Sorry about my pronunciation. There are some issues that the inhabitants are facing when it comes to the access to the site, when it comes to people not living in the neighborhood. And I was wondering how to react to that when we're in this transformation phase, when Sao Paulo is still seeking new public spaces, and before we get all of that, we have to somehow respond to this. And I know that the people living in the building are searching right now for adding new gates and maybe some other interventions to stop basically people living around entering the perimeter. And I think it's more of a start of a discussion, because this is very an open-end question, because there is probably no one solution to answer this, but maybe there are some already interesting ideas put forward in the city. That would be very interesting to hear.
Okay, thank you for your question, Caroline. It's really a very important issue for us, and for, well, we deal with the housing, social housing issues in Brazil and in some parts of the world, of course. And well, recently we tried to deal with that, this kind of concept that Angela Fabi used a lot, that called a kind of dialectical process between architecture and urban design and the everyday life. And this answer can, well, suppose that the solution of this kind of process isn't in the architecture or in the urban design, and isn't too in the economical political issues. It's like in the both process that you can put together in the same context. As you can say, I try to say that we, like an architect or urban planner, we can do buildings that maybe support or incentivize this kind of connection between people, or between the new buildings and the city. But of course, after the building or outside the building, there is some kind of sociological or historical construction in terms of local culture that is different to deal with in the first contact. What I note in some projects from active elected that is different from others in Brazil is that what they are think about this kind of connection, and even so, in some period or in some moment, they are doing some demonstration. The governments or the administrations or included the inhabitants, constructor, or who live in the buildings, some gateway or close the residential area. They can suppose that in the future we can remove that and connect it again with the city. But when you see another example of building that is the fence or the gateway community or the condominium or in the design process, you can see that it's impossible that you understand me that the building, the architecture and the construction, it's the first solution, the first input for the project is the privatization of the block or the privatization of the plot and the isolation of the community. In this sense, we suppose that we have a very important, how can I say, goal nowadays that is to change our typological traditional architecture for another one more inclusive, more near the streets, and more capable for introduce this kind of public or counter-public space in the everyday life of our city. I don't know if I answering your question, but I agree with you. It's a beginning of it's the great question of the project that you were doing and the process of discourse in São Paulo.
Maybe I would just
thank you.
Jump into Carolina's question to connect also with the question I had triggered by your presentation. And then, as I mentioned before, everybody's welcome also to type their questions in the chat. And then at a certain moment, Leandro, you, while showing this, obviously very sexy images of Pedregulho, then you mentioned something that caught my attention. That you referred to projects, I assume, like Pedregulho, as something that were kind of an instance or an example of fake modernism, right? I think you mentioned that. I think it's an interesting, and then you even related that with that quote from the 16th century that put, emphasizing how in Brazil, the house is the republic, not really the city, right? And that is, I think, quite an interesting, aspect to address. Now, my question is, for instance, those examples that you showed as part of the four lenses, the block, the informal innovations, the commons, and the reuse, it was also quite interesting to notice that all of these, typologically, let's say, they explored the figure of the block, right? So of the say stacked apartment block, even the reuse of Riachuelo. It's also a kind of course, of a different nature, but still based on the figure of the stacked apartment block. And I wonder, because there is a sort of a conspicuous absence in this story of the last 20 years, I think, but maybe you prove me wrong, which is experiments like, for instance, Usina's projects with participatory processes. I mean, like Pedro showed to us like 1 month ago or so. So would that, I mean, how do you see, maybe this kind of, parallel process to those cases that you showed that, what people like Usina are doing? I mean, how do you see that those participatory processes can be a way of really bringing back the city as the republic and not the house, or the other way around?
Yeah, it's a very good question and very difficult too, because
sorry for
with
that.
a kind of I have to say a kind of a local heresy to in terms of criticize or modern architecture. That's what you have like a very cool historical events in terms of architecture, in terms of globalization, indeed. But I like that you understand that there is a kind of shift, rotation, a difference between what he did in our urban spaces before the 20th century and after that. The modernity of the idea of modern architecture was more intense for us than in Europe or including the United States, because the connection with a very strong way with the intention of your society or the part of your society to construct a new country with new bases, and the modernity of the spaces and cities and buildings and architecture at all. It's very important to organize this kind of new aesthetic elements that signalize that Brazil will be the country of the future with industry, modernization, a new society, not that country with slaves and the farms and the cafe and so on. And for you and for the international audience, maybe it's not so strong, but for us, it's part of the constitution of the 20th century, and include because of that in the 80s and including the 90s, we discussed at the university architects like Niemeyer, Le Corbusier, modernity, CIM, City Lungs in German, not so like something new, but like something that you have to maintain as an argument. And we know that in that time around the world, the discussion was totally different. The architecture was modern, the constructivism and innovation, and try to do another thing. Is very expressive the way that many architects try to do an architecture or urban planning as a reaction against the urban, the modern movement. You know, the block is something against the modern idea of city or of the modern idea of social housing, for example. But after the 90s, in the beginning of the century, some architects and some architect schools start to realize that we need to change. We need to reorganize our base in terms of architectures. And some architects like Hector Leca was very important in this process because he has a different information and different inputs in terms of basis, or how can I say, the influences for your architecture. And sadly, he and other architects discovered that we need to reconnect our architecture to the city. And it is not kind of only a kind of a political or utopian issues. It's issues that have a very close connection with the urban design or architecture and the urban plans. It's because of that some new urban plans and master plans from São Paulo, the first one in 2004 and the second one in 2014 and another one in 2016. They try to offer this kind of possibility to construct this new kind of building, a new kind of urbanization. because before that, even though if you try to connect the city with perimeter blocks or with some circumstance that try to some experience of social mix or functional mix that we learn a lot around the world. And it was like impossible because the legislation, I can say that, and it's forbidding for the law. You have to, even though if you want to do that, now it's not true. You can see some experience in another direction, and you try to understand what you can do with that, not only, like copy paste from the international European architecture, but understand our past, our reality, and try to do something original and appropriate for this kind of vision of the urban planning.
I would like to make a quick comment. Nelson?
Go for it, Luis.
Yeah, as a historical approach about this question, I made some notes during the lecture that I think that connects with your concerns. What's known as Brazilian modern architecture did not offer models for social housing, nor for the urban spatiality of large cities. I highlight what I consider the main spatial paradigms defined by Brazilian architecture. Its first moment in the 40s, with my work, was constituted in relation to an idealized landscape, and then as exceptionality and contrast, not a confrontation with the urban landscape. The second moment in the late 50s and during the 60s, with the work of Vilanova Artigas, was constituted as an elaboration of intra-lot space, with urban indications based on something that can be, roughly speaking, related to American suburbanization. As for social housing projects, these paradigms did not result in models for average production. Its great exceptions, like Copin and Pedregulho, were trials that were rendered impossible beyond the political difficulties. They were spatially unfeasible, as Niemeyer well understands the failure of Copin in relation to the principle of his architecture, which demands the void of the surroundings. Having said that, we must problematize the essays to extend this logic in relation to the housing and the city. The housing complexes produced, such as the API, did not present any technical or spatial innovation, limiting themselves to reproducing post-war architecture models without the same concern, also a failure in general, of producing collective spaces. Therefore, for us, it's about a paradigm shift. The recent examples shown by Leandro are attempts at this shift. They try to understand urban space and collective housing based on other spatial models. However, confronting the anti-urbanity of our architecture models collides, in this case, with the social spatial segregation that this type of condition poses, and which can only be faced lightly by design. That's my quick comment about all this, trying to connect these recent projects to our modern tradition. And it's not, I don't need to reinforce this, but it's a very peculiar point of view. It's not what you can easily find elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you, Luis. It's perfect. When we I put it together, this project, it seems like a movement, but it's not true. We are doing this movement. Well, this project appeared through the city like in isolated context, but we are trying to analyze that as a group. And it's not easy because it's a very strong and new process in the city.
Yes, thank you so much, Luis. Indeed, very. I don't know how you make all these well-articulated thoughts while you are listening to the lecture. I envy you for that. Any other inputs or questions from colleagues or students? Yeah. So.
Nelson, this is like a mantra, you know, a mantra.
Ah.
It's every morning.
Okay, I can see. So you do that training. All right. Yeah, well, thank you so much. I mean, it's also great that the lecture is recorded, right? So, and I think we need to rewatch, let's say, the this presentation, the cases again, let's say, because they really need some, thoughtful understanding, let's say, complementing, of course, with what we discussed already. You want to say something, Leandro?
No. It's okay.
Right. But I would just, but this maybe just for a quick, I was just also trying to tease you to elaborate just a little bit on something that seems to be parallel or running parallel to the cases you presented, which would be the work and the kind of processes that people like Usina are developing. I say, where would this fit in the contemporary housing or experiments in social housing in São Paulo?
Yeah,
would this be a fifth category, or
yes, exactly. The work of Usina and the Piabiru is another group like Usina that you work with the same strategy or similar strategies. Removed just this morning because I suppose that it was too large for today, but it's another category, I suppose, too. They are trying to do a kind of bottom-up process, as we saw in the lecture from Pedro Rentes, and it's really very different. They have a very strong influence from Sérgio Ferro, and what they try to do is create a kind of process in the aesthetic that is more close than the community or the public or the people that lives in some place. And the result is very difficult to exemplify as an image. For example, if you go to the website from Usina or the website of Piabiru, you see plans and photos with the groups, with the group, the architects, with the community, and data and numbers and things like that. And it's like impossible to see draws and images like the common one in architecture, because in the limit, the result in terms of traditional work architecture is not so important for these groups. They prefer to make the process very strong and to make the new place more close than the community in no sense. And then I suppose that's because of that it's difficult to see around the world, including Brazil, photos and the articles for the projects that Piabiru and Usina produce, because it's in some cases it seems like how can I say proposital, please. Portuguese mandatory. What?
Well done in purpose.
On purpose.
On purpose.
On purpose.
Intentional.
They don't. Intentional. They
deliberate.
don't have it. Beautiful in our sense or common sense or architecture. They try to demonstrate that the aesthetic is, in the literal sense, isn't so important. And they put in some slang a very simple one, and they say in lectures, well, it's nothing. The problem is another one. It's a social relationship. It's the connection with the community and the can do. And ordinary or very common building in this area. And the people will appropriate the building from another way, and they put their colors, the colors that they want to put in the windows, and so on. And because of that, I try to. I suppose that they are in a very different category in your lecture or in this group. Includes because they have a very strong political, how can I say, issues in terms of ideology.
Agenda.
Agenda, yes. And they believe in an architecture and as an instrument of political transformation, not. And we try to do something more in the sense of this dialectical process between the disciplinary field and the everyday life. And I suppose that they don't believe at all in this kind of approach. They respect, as we respect a lot what they do, but they really don't believe in architecture in this kind of sense.
Can I make a comment about that?
Yeah,
I know we don't have time. Yeah, but your presentation, which was really great, and I think it was a major contribution for our, the lineage of lectures that we have, because I think it will really play at large in the imaginary of our students. We've seen projects that were not commented, so it was really great. I was just wondering, I would say that there is the lineage you present, and I've been trying to tell our students at TU Delft, I'm sure the ones at FAU have a better knowledge about that, is that housing is such an exceptional program in our, history of architecture and in modernism in Brazil, which is a very rich one, but it's curiously enough, I mean, housing is perhaps the main program of architectural modernism in Europe, I would say, not in the US, of course, but in Brazil, it's true that it is not. But I would say that it's such an exceptional program that there is an effort and an endeavor on the side of architects to kind of think of housing as infrastructure. And I think, starting from the individual house, from Artigas' famous motto, the house as a city, cities as houses, that expands. So each opportunity is also one that tries to somehow connect to an infrastructural endeavor of, let's take this opportunity to provide the most, to connect to what we can, to bring, I would say it's something that I could establish an analogy. I already did that when I was talking to, in my question to Vigliecca. Alexandre Delijaikov cells, which is not, it's more than a school, is a center for urban structuring somehow. Let's take this. So because public programs in Brazil are so exceptional in their, let's say, welcoming of design ideas, that each opportunity for a public investment becomes this kind of infrastructural thought that in São Paulo is largely indebted to Artigas. And then I would think that perhaps a way to kind of establish an analogy with Nelson's point about, the ferristas, let's say, the architects who start to think about the process rather than the product, and are very skeptical of a major state intervention that would somehow never come, is that they also think of housing as a major opportunity to perhaps organize society. So they also think of a network, but a network of people. So I would say it's also an infrastructural thought, but one that is more of a human infrastructure, let's say, how to organize those movements in the territory and how they could perhaps take over and organize other initiatives of the same kind. I'm not sure if it makes sense, but that's what Nelson's question actually made me think of. But I would say, I mean, as a kind of major conclusion is that I would want to let our students know, especially the ones at U Delft, that housing is an exceptional program for architects, because our sad reality is really, you know, the reality.
Da empresa que está dentro.
Eu desliguei.
Sorry?
Sorry.
Yes, so basically I'm just trying to say, we had a
Zoom bombing.
A Zoom bombing.
Zoom bombing. Zoom bombing.
So it is just to say that housing is a very exceptional program, and yeah, one that architects try to make the most of in their different approaches to architecture, I would say.
Right. Well, great. I think, well, as you can see, we could just stay here the whole afternoon. This is really an interesting debate. But in the interest of keeping time, because we have a couple of things we would like to take the remaining 30 minutes to address. I would say, well, again, thank you so much, Leandro. A great lecture and really a lot of food for thought.